Hey folks, so I truly appreciate it is a gorgeous day outside, so thank you for taking the time to come and listen to our talk. It's going to be a lot of fun. We've got a great panel. We all know each other pretty well, so we'll make it practical and interesting, I hope. But my name is Christina Caljé. As was said, I'm going to be moderating the panel for Balancing in Motion. We'll be talking about the complexities of scaling companies that are operating in regulated environments. So I consider myself to be a multi-hyphenate. I'm an entrepreneur, an investor, also an ecosystem player. And in this capacity, I'm also CEO of TINTT, which stands for Too Important Not to Try. We focus on storytelling around the complexities of scaling frontier tech. So that brings me to our incredible panel today that we've curated for you. So I will just bring up Michiel from Northzone, Duco from Duna, the founder of Duna. I like how you did the little running, jogging up here. Pim from CTO of Next Sense. And Sandro Gianella, working on policy and partnerships at OpenAI. So thanks for you all. So I gave a little bit of an introduction to myself. The one thing I'll say is going into this is that what we're going to accomplish with this panel is really to frame it a little bit for everybody. What are the considerations and the complexities of the different types of companies that are operating in regulated sectors? I mean, also to have really candid conversations. The folks here have all been building and scaling and investing in these types of companies for years. And hopefully you'll all come away with some takeaways as well on how you can navigate dealing with regulators and when. So I'll just go down along and ask you each to give a quick introduction of yourselves, starting with Michiel.
Okay, I'm Michiel. I'm a partner at Northzone, a large early stage fund covering Europe and the US. I also started an AI company 25 years ago with calculators. On the west coast of the US, so the only regulation we had to follow was not to run out of money. I worked in pharma, where you couldn't write an email without the legal department first sort of taking a week to review it. And now I do a mix of AI and digital health investing, so have some exposure to these things.
Absolutely, great, thank you. And bringing the investor's perspective as well. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Duco. I'm co-founder of Duna. We build a platform for compliant business onboarding, and over time we want to make that a network for reusable identities, like a Visa, MasterCard for identity. Our customers are, for example, a brand new day bank, Bol.com, Plaid. And to make it a bit more concrete, because my mother is always asking me, like, so what the hell are you doing? If you are on Bol, and if you buy something, there's often a third-party reseller that is sending you those goods. Well, in order to pay them out, Bol needs to adhere to all types of regulations, do background checks. Are they not on Russian sanctions list? Don't they have fraudulent passports? Are they selling what they think they sell? Are they not transporting things to Iran, etc.? All those anti-money laundering and anti-criminality checks is what we do at Duna. So, for example, one of our customers recently spent 7 to 8 days to onboard a customer, and now, within 2 months after they're live, the median analyst time is 3.5 minutes.
Wow. We love those sorts of really scalable numbers, the 100x or something in that case of time saved. Congrats. And Pim, give it a quick intro.
So my name is Pim Rutgers, I'm CTO of Next Sense, and we build AI systems to optimize buildings to reduce their carbon emission. And why that's important is because 40% of all carbon emissions is from the built environment, and 20% is from operations of buildings. So we really think that we need to disrupt this industry and disrupt these real estate buildings that just emit so much CO2, and that's what we do.
Fantastic, thank you. And Sandro.
Hey everyone, I'm Sandro. I work at OpenAI. I guess we're the reason all of you have to talk about AI right now, so sorry about that. I run a team called Policy and Partnerships, where we interact with and educate regulators and policymakers and society at large about all the good things that will happen in an AI world and how to mitigate some of the bad things. And I also am an angel investor, where I invest mostly in companies that kind of have to find ways to navigate policy and regulatory complexity.
And a fun fact that Duco and Sandro also used to work together at Stripe, so they can share some other examples from other companies in a regulated space. But so as we had our prep conversation, we realized that it can be actually quite complicated, and it depends on what the strategy might be, on how you engage with regulators and what your relationship might be with those regulators. So we're going to try to frame it for all of you by talking through first-person examples of these different categories of regulatory relationship. So I'll try to list them out, so we'll try to repeat them so that folks can sort of remember them, but hopefully it'll be clear as we're talking them through. But one of the first is those companies that are building products based on a specialized knowledge of a specific regulation, and either in a specific sector or a specific region. And so Duco from Duna and Pim from Next Sense will sort of give that founder's perspective on how they're navigating in that space. A second category of company we talked about was those that are building products that are in a very constantly evolving environment, a regulatory environment. So AI, obviously, and that's very region-specific as well. So that's where Sandro can give an incredible perspective on in OpenAI, how he's actually shaping policy globally. And then with Pim, he also is operating in the energy environment, and we're seeing, because of certain geopolitical changes in the world, that there's a shift in how companies and regulators are looking around some mandates around the regulations for sustainability. So I think it'll be really interesting from that perspective to talk through. And then there's also those, like Michiel mentioned, that can't even go into the market until they've already gotten regulatory approvals. So we think of those in the sort of biotech, healthcare space. And the last one is maybe the most fun and most startup-y, is there's regulations out there, but we don't give a shit. We just go and we break them anyway, and we sort of go against it and deal with the consequences later. So we'll try to talk about all of those different categories. So starting it off, I'd like to start with Duco. One thing you didn't mention, but I'll mention for you, is that you're fresh off of a fundraise with Duna, so congratulations. It's that exciting time when you're transitioning to building again and not the investor engagement. But I think the fact that you also were at Stripe previously, and you built out their entire operations across Europe, you have, and it being a fintech in a regulated environment, you were there for years as it scaled. I think that's also an interesting perspective, and would love to hear some of your learnings. But with Duna, what do you see the role of regulation playing in your case? So you're now sort of creating this platform efficiency through your product. Do you see it as a growth lever for you, or is it a potential hinder of your growth?
Yeah, so our business is built on compliance, and our perspective on regulators and regulation is it's better to work with a regulator than against a regulator. And what we do with our customers, we build our company around a policy engine that takes in all the compliance policies that our customers want and automatically creates the right business outcomes from that. Because the challenge that many businesses have is nobody starts a business to become a compliance expert. So every fintech founder you talk to will tell you, well, maybe apart from us, like it's not their core business, that's why it's ours. But nobody started their business because they love adhering to AML regulations and sitting with their compliance and risk officer. So how we see it is this is mission critical, but not your core business. And if it's mission critical, you need to do it at high quality. But if it's not your core business, you don't want to spend product and engineering resources on that. So that's our relationship with regulation. If it then comes to influencing regulation, and that was also one of the questions that we discussed, I think that's an absolute waste of time. Like, if a startup...
Don't hold back.
If a startup is like spending all of their time trying to influence a regulator, I get the same vibes as a startup CEO who's continuously on every startup meetup just drinking beers. Feels a bit more like a show entrepreneur than somebody who wants to scale the business.
Yeah.
By the time you've influenced that regulation, either your product had changed or your business is dead. We hired, I still remember the time we hired Sandro at Stripe. It was like a decade ago. And back then Stripe was valued at $9 billion. And the last time I checked this morning, Duna wasn't yet worth $9 billion. So I'm not spending any time on that one.
Yeah. And so do you spend more of your time then understanding the regulations, so deep diving into it and seeing where there's ways to optimize your product to streamline across jurisdictions, or is that where you see
Exactly. So that's where we spend our time. And to just, as an example of what type of compliance geeks we are, yesterday evening at 11:30, my co-founder went to bed and he said, I'm going to watch Netflix and then I'll go over this compliance policy of a user. I was like, are you serious? Yeah, I need like 40 minutes of Knight Rider and then it's going to spend 65 pages of this specific enterprise user reading through their compliance policies. So that's what we try to do.
So he was watching Netflix and then rewarded himself with the policy.
Exactly, that's it.
I mean, I think there's one exception to what Duco's saying, and I very, very much agree with what he's saying, is that in general, it is the big companies speaking on behalf of the tech industry and helping us kind of shape the regulations the way it works for a modern world. And very grateful for Sandro and the likes of him of doing that. At the same time, at an industry level, there is a number of sectors where the regulations are absolutely lethal for small companies.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't recommend to any small company to spend any time on trying to fight that, but I'm very happy that the VC industry, that some industry leaders, that some of the people like TechLeap, et cetera, are always advocating on our behalf and saying, listen, yes, what you're dealing with in tech is very big and is very important, and we need to protect the population against the future of the killer robots or medicine that's not healthy, et cetera. At the same time, to require of a 10-person startup that they follow the same deep-level regulation as a 10,000-person company is terrible.
Yeah.
And we have to do something about it.
Yeah.
And obviously, that's where a big rift between the US and Europe is emerging, where we're buried under a lot more regulation
Hold
than they
that
are.
thought. We'll definitely come back to that a little bit later. But I think just to summarize Duco's point a bit, as a company that's sort of built on your expertise of regulations, you're really spending your time understanding those, and as new things come out, you'll sort of deep dive into them. Spend reading your 65-page manifestos of the new regulations to incorporate that into the product. But in other cases, so with Pim and Sandro as well, like as the regulations are evolving, as the landscape is evolving. I find your current situation, Pim, so relatable to many founders, I think, in the audience right now. So you started off the year there was a lot of tailwinds for the sustainability industry, a lot of mandates, a lot of interest, and a lot of the culture was supporting, a more working towards a more climate neutrality. And now we have a shift in politicians around the globe. The tides have changed a bit. And so can you talk a little bit about how that's affected your company and how you're navigating it with this changing trend?
That is affecting our company greatly. So indeed, start of the year, pipeline was fully filled. CSRD, which is Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, was fully on, and it's actually still on, so we'll talk about it a little bit later, but that's a directive where each corporate has to report on their emissions, for example, and part of those emissions are your building emissions that you're renting out, right? So for us, it's a huge driver. So clients like Chanel, Microsoft, ING, they need to report on their offices. So it's a regulatory, and you have just a check mark which you can go to clients, and they want that thing because they want to be compliant, right? And then indeed, politics happen, and let's say that CSRD is still there. But the sentiment has changed.
Yeah.
And sentiment comes over from the US to Europe, and suddenly CSRD, everybody's like, well, actually we only have to implement that in 2026. So let's see what the next year will bring in relaxation of these reported directives.
Yeah.
So then you see this pipeline just dwindling down, and it's suddenly from 10 buildings to only a pilot project. And let's wait a bit, and we might have budget in December. And that's kind of the risk of building, on top of a directive like that, because bottom line, what our software does is making your building more valuable. So now what we do, how we handle it is we have to change our narrative.
Yeah.
So the software is the same, what we do is the same, But a narrative doesn't go to, hey, you'll be compliant, but the narrative is, hey, your building will just be better and worth more, which is actually bottom line always what we're trying to do.
Isn't that interesting? I think in the startup world also, it's so much about narrative and so much about the storytelling. But I'm curious also just from a sort of morale perspective, how has that affected the team at all? Because I've talked to a lot of leaders like yourself who are a bit frustrated also just because you're working towards good in the world. And how does that affect your team?
Of course it's frustrating. Of course it's frustrating to see pipeline dwindle, to not land deals, to have them slip around. And it's even more frustrating that not everybody is on the same page, because that directive is there for a reason.
Yeah.
So Europeans are agreeing that we need to do that. But it's just, if you cannot sell that, right, then it's frustrating that the industry doesn't want to buy impact and doesn't want to even buy the compliance. So yeah, that's frustrating. But it's also, sometimes as a small company or like a scale-up, changing the narrative is also sometimes, bringing, again, more energy or more like, hey, wait a minute, maybe this is the right point.
I mean, this is the life of an entrepreneur, right? You're constantly evolving. But maybe that's also, we mentioned before the focus on energy. Obviously, you're also operating with AI, artificial intelligence. So maybe, Sandro, we can delve into that a little bit as well, because that's another regulatory environment that Pim has to navigate with his company. But OpenAI is a huge voice, obviously, in influencing how things are being shaped globally and here in Europe, where your focus is. And you did it at Stripe as well, but I also wonder how do you view your role, because it is so much more societally influencing when you're influencing these regulators and public perceptions. How do you view your role in policy informing, and what are your goals as a policy influencer?
Yeah, appreciate it. I think maybe to pick up on what's been said on what my role at Stripe felt like, I do agree that there is a point where you need to really understand rather than shape the policy and regulatory environment that you're operating in. But I think the other thing you need to understand is when the ground starts to shift. And I don't think that necessarily requires you to be in every room. They're saying like, oh, if you're not on the menu or at the table and all of these things. I don't think you need to be in all of these places. But I do think the saying, you're not interested in politics, but politics is interested in you, holds true. I think you need to have an understanding of who are the people who are influencing the policy and the regulation, and why is it there in the first place. And most often it is incumbent industries who have been doing this for decades. And to understand why a certain policy or regulation or certain rules of the road exists and what it would take for them to change, I think is important. And an example is central bank digital currency, stable coins, everything that we're seeing now. This was what I was tracking 5-6 years ago, where you could start to see a potential shift of the tectonic plates that might not happen overnight. But I think if you are building a VC-backed business, you need to have a case or an understanding of what you're going to do if these tectonic plates are shifting. And I don't think it requires you to be in every room, but you have a rough understanding of what are the powers and the circumstances when the game is really going to change, and you need to adapt to it. You're right, I think my role at OpenAI feels different. I think what we decided before, and especially when we launched ChatGPT, and to our surprise, a lot of people wanted to use it, was that we can't afford to be reactive. This technology, and we've known it for a long time, is going to have massive effects on our economies, on our societies. And we didn't have all the answers at the time 2 years ago, but we knew we had to be out there. We wanted to be educating and explaining why it is what we're doing, what it is that we're doing, and what our sense is the effects are going to be. And so that's why kind of my first couple of weeks at the company was when we sent Sam around the world to meet with developers, to meet with heads of state, to meet with regulators. And a lot of it came down to actually educating, mostly about the technology, not necessarily coming with a point of view or you need to do A, B, and C, because I think we believe quite strongly that the next years we're going to see quite a fundamental shift on how we live, how we work, and that is ultimately what our elected representatives need to figure out and need to deal with. So indeed, my role now feels a lot more a kind of translator between our societies and our technology rather than a specific regulator in a piece of technology.
Yeah, and it's also shifting so quickly. Technology is advancing at such a fast pace. So I can imagine that your role is changing on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
And maybe just to shift to Michiel with the investor's perspective. So you can also, you mentioned that you're an entrepreneur at the very beginning, which I love as an investor, by the way, that you have that lived experience to bring. But you have invested in quite a few healthcare companies, I think. And that's one of those areas where I, as an angel investor, have in theory avoided because of the complexities it feels like in this very binary result of whether or not they get approval and whether the market is big enough, where they get the approval. So I'd love to hear from your perspective. I think in Europe you might be one of the outliers in terms of your risk tolerance, because a lot of the European investors here are looking for a certain amount of proven market validation, proven profitability. How do you get comfortable when you're investing in these higher risk companies that don't yet have their product in market?
Yeah, it's a complicated path, and it really depends on the type of company and what you're looking at, because obviously on the one extreme there's people investing in biotech, which we don't do, where it's a molecule with a very, very long sort of timeline of passing the different risk gates, but with the benefits of it being very clear what you need to do to qualify. So it is much more a scientific assessment. Do you think it'll pass the risk gates, rather than what will the regulator say? Versus entirely on the other side of it, where you at this moment see in a lot of digital diagnostics and therapeutics that are guided by AI, that the progress on the technology side is much faster than what the regulator is adapted to or can understand. And to give an example, before, if you had a medical device, it's like the medical device does what the medical device does. You go through regulatory approval and then it's a status quo. Versus if you create an AI algorithm that helps diagnose a disease, the quality of the algorithm today is going to be very different from that in 6 months' time and 12 months' time, et cetera. And theoretically, every time you want to claim more efficacy, you have to regulate and get approval again, which is obviously not in the interest neither of the people able to get treatment and for the people making it. So there, the assessment is much more of, do we see the regulation moving? Do we have a smart strategy of saying, okay, the first time you need to do it very elaborately, and then there's sort of, you file adjustments. And I think the last thing, which is the same thing in any kind of more complex investment that you make, it's, does the team understand the hurdles ahead of them in the road? And do you believe these are great people and they'll figure it out? So rather than me trying to figure out can they or can they not, it's like, okay, I see why they could. If anyone could, they could. The sort of the founder hustle, the founder adaptability, resilience, I think is and expertise and all of it.
So you earlier on talked a little bit about what we can do as an ecosystem. So I'd like to sort of shift this to make it a bit more of a roundtable amongst ourselves conversations now, to have a little bit more fun with it. So we framed the context. There's 4 sort of types of companies, those operating in the evolving regulatory environment, those that are building on a certain regulatory stack, those that have to get approval before they launch, and then some that just sort of ignore it all. But since Duco started off by saying you had such a strong opinion, I'm going to ask you, if you were invited to a roundtable with a very relevant regulator, let's say, I would assume like the Dutch Central Bank, for instance, would you go to that event? Very practical.
Yeah, of course. So if I would be invited, I would show up.
He's just a nice guy. He's a nice guy. So, he'll show up.
And considering how nice the new building is, I assume they serve good coffee. And it's nearby on my bike. No, but also if it's longer travel, of course I would go there and tell the story and give insights from the market. Same if in The Hague, members of parliament want to interview you about what can we do for the startup ecosystem or for startup equity or tax reasons, of course you would go. I think that is valuable. I just don't think it's valuable if a quarterly goal or a yearly KPI of our company is to actively influence that regulation. So I'm there taking more a passenger seat, and then what could help is that And a lot of the bigger companies, like an iGen here in the Netherlands, do is they donate to TechLeap, and TechLeap is doing a lot of great work on our behalf. And for that I'm grateful, and if TechLeap would ever want my help for something, I would come, because I'm very grateful for a lot of impact they've had for our ecosystem. But I think that is the right level of a type of company that should be in the driver's seat, or maybe an iGen or an ASML, or the bigger type of companies. And for us, we're more a passenger that's happy to give our opinion.
How about you, Sandro? You have any thoughts on this?
I think I agree with your point that there are, and it's great to see more and more organizations, startup organization, Allied for Startups. Every EU member state has now organizations that represent this growing ecosystem, and I think they rightly often picked like what are things that if we fix them, they're good for every company. You know, the 28 regime, EU Inc. is doing great work, stock option reform, and I think that was the right thing to do at the time, to look at what are things that if policymakers fix it, it will lift all boats and it will help for everyone. I have a feeling that now what we need to do is to help policymakers, like educate them about the technological shifts that are happening. Because I think what Michiel was saying is it is now clear that this technology that we're now all building on top of is going to allow us to do things better, different, faster, and our institutions, by necessity, it's almost a feature. We don't want policymakers to change legislation every 2 months because a new piece of technology comes along. So it's almost a feature for the system to be slower than the technology is moving. But I think we need to, if we can work together, to educate them about why we as an ecosystem are excited, afraid, work on, comment, these new pieces of technology that come along, and really help them understand that this is not just yet another thing that's happening, but it might fundamentally question the way that they've built their institutions and the way our healthcare systems work, the way our education systems work. I think that type of wake-up call is needed, and every voice matters in that.
And I think it's twice as much in sort of on the more general tech versus banking and healthcare, because at least there, these institutions have done a lot of very specialist kind of work, and if you have stablecoin coming in, the central bank actually kind of understands pretty well what's going on. Versus if you saw the US Congress kind of interviewing Mark Zuckerberg a while back, and the level of questions of this sort of general part, it's like it's so far away from where the reality is. So that education.
Does that say something about Americans that we're a little
less? No, because that's no different here in our parliament.
No,
it's just
I
more
understand.
That, you know.
But I think that's the practical point I was thinking as you were saying that, Sandro, is how do you explain the technology? Is it bringing them in to look at labs of some of our biotechs, or looking at having developers explain code?
Maybe one pet peeve I have, a strong view, is like the Commission and member states and parliaments always organize these events to then expect startup founders to come to them and explain what it is they're doing.
Yeah.
Which they do, but I think, why don't you just go where they are? Like I've tried to push them, go to Slush, go to the Next Web, go to these places and just immerse yourself a little bit into that.
That's the thing, not just be there and be on your laptop and like write your emails.
I think you need to get them out of,
I agree.
Either it's a regulator that has a mandate on a very specific piece of technology or system, whether it's education, healthcare, and I think then they're almost forced to deal with it when the new technology comes along. But I think this general education almost needs to happen at a societal level, and that's much harder to do.
And so I went to these kind of things in Brussels, right?
Yes, I was going to ask
you try to, so you go there so for all startup founders, don't do it. It's a waste of time. Why? Because you go there and you really go there with the intention that you think that you're on the table, right? You're on the menu, you're going to sit there. You sit there and a talk starts, and actually you just get contextualized into a regulation that already exists, and there's almost like you don't have any power to actually change what's happening there, right? So, and then I even tried to be in this work panel that every week has a session, and after a month we're like, okay, this is just not going anywhere. There's 35 voices here. The bigger voices are from Siemens and Johnson Controls. Like, we cannot spend that amount of time. Like, there's a guy that worked for 30 years in Johnson Controls. He owns that. But I don't have the time, right? I have to build. I have to do other things. So, to do that and to listen and to really understand what is changing, yes. But don't, as a startup founder, go to Brussels.
But I think what I worry about is the cumulative effect of that being the feeling of most startup founders,
Yes.
which I agree with for every individual. But then you see the cumulative effect where we also complain that, they
They're
don't
not
get
listening.
it. They're not listening.
They're not
You know,
listening. Yeah.
because if they don't end up being able to talk to and listen to people that are doing things differently, using the technology in a different way, solving a problem in a way that they haven't seen solved before. So what I think about a lot is it makes sense on an individual level for each founder not to do it, but I think collectively, if we don't do it as an ecosystem, I think we're going to feel it in a couple of years.
Absolutely.
Because they're going to
Yeah.
continue to listen to and be engaged with the incumbents and the Siemens guy for 20 years rather than with you.
And I think, and I want to sort of end our panel with some final thoughts, but starting with Ms. Michiel, because I think, well, you touched upon it earlier, so I want to give you the chance to expand upon it a little bit. But I think that if there's a way, like we talked about Tech Leap, there's certain trade associations like CTA, which organizes CES. I think there's country-specific ones. But where do you see your role as a venture capital company? I mean, I think there's also, we didn't touch upon it much, US, Asia versus Europe, but maintaining competitiveness.
I think
Where do you see that?
the role is very simple, and it's interesting because as with startups in general, there is always way more initiatives than great initiatives. And so, first of all,
Should we
spotting
consolidate then?
of everything, you don't have to consolidate, you just back the winner.
Okay.
And so I think one of the things we can do is from everything that's going on, recognize what is serious, what really makes sense to lean into, etc. Then number two, we're sitting on this very special position because of the work we do, that we know a ton load of people,
Yeah.
and that a bunch of really interesting people are willing to listen. And so therefore, help recruit the right kind of people to a certain initiative. That is, I think, the second thing. And then the third thing, if the initiative wants support or proof or say, hey, we now all of a sudden want 1,000 startups to speak up about the option, then we can sort of be utilized that kind of way. So
Yeah.
I think it is developing the relationship with the right initiatives and then being helpful rather than having an idea exactly how to do it or spend half my time on it.
Last 20 seconds, I'll ask each of you to answer. Is there an initiative or a challenge that you think we should all band around and try to work together to solve for? I'll start with you, Michiel, and then quickly go down.
Yeah, for me, it's not suffocate small AI companies with regulatory requirements that are very, very reasonable to put on the very largest ones.
Okay. Duco?
I would be working with the regulator instead of against them. If you're an innovative fintech entrepreneur, you aren't working at the regulator, and also vice versa. So we also can be a bit more appreciative. Like, this is another type of people with other type of incentives.
Yeah.
And then work with them at the high level on like startup equity, tax, AI innovation, etc. Not on the startup level.
Pim?
Yeah, I want to say, so if you build a product on top of regulations, make sure that on the bottom line, there's also just big ROI. Right? The regulation is the push, and it's not the check mark that will get there.
And
I think that is really important.
Working towards impact,
Yes.
competitiveness. Yes. Sandro, lastly.
For me, one of the great examples of working with regulators but also doing things differently is EU Inc. that my friend Andreas is running to push for a 28th regime to try and solve how different and complicated it is to invest across borders in Europe and the mess that exists for angels. And I think that picking these vertical issues that is going to raise the ability to have more funding across borders and more people become angels, I think is something that all of us should help out on.
Great. Well, hopefully there's a couple of those different stakeholder groups in the audience. You know what to focus on. I want to thank the audience for being here in this nice, beautiful day, being inside, and thank the panelists, Michiel, Duco, Pim, and Sandro for being here. And thank you. Enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. All right.